And without further ado, I will turn it over to Mitchell and Jane and Andy.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. Today I'm nobody. Today, thank you, yes. It's a real honor to be here to help facilitate a conversation which I know, having known Jane and Andy for many, many years. In fact, we met working on a book that was decidedly not Depression-era food. Foie Gras, A Passion was a book that they did a great history of foie gras, the opposite of the food we'll be talking about today in some ways. And I would say to you, if you haven't, you must read this book, as you must read all of their other books, because they provide one of the rare depictions of food in a cultural context that is both delicious and enlightening and educational, and that resonates, I mean, as the introductory remarks said, with experiences we've all had, but maybe not thought about in a historical way. And so I want to actually start with a very simple and obvious question, but what is this Depression era that we're talking about? What is the Great Depression? When and what defines it? And let's just start with that.
Our book covers the period from the end of World War I to the beginning of World War II. But the Great Depression, I think, fairly clearly began in 1929. It actually, the economy began to go down during 1929, and the Great Crash in October was the sort of big event that sort of marks it for everybody. And then the question is, when did the Depression end? And that's a little bit harder to define, but I think certainly by Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, 1941, it had ended. And one of the reasons that it ended, which we talk about in our book, was the fact that even before Pearl Harbor, America was building up its defenses, and their huge factories were opening all across the country, and employment shot up, and hunger and malnutrition went down because people had work.
Please, you can do whatever you'd like.
I'm going to disagree with Andy. All right. No, I mean, refine something you said. I think that the start of the Depression for the people who lived through it was also elusive. People didn't know that they were in the Great Depression. And every spring, pretty much for the duration of the Depression, there were expectations that the economy was about to snap back. And that had profound implications for the way people were fed.
You stole my next question out from under me, which is great, because I think that notion that when you're living through something is very different from when you're looking back and defining it is something that's so rich about this book. And I'd like you to express a little bit, since we're here at the Tenement Museum and we're presumably a room full of New Yorkers, or everyone's a New Yorker tonight in this room, let's say. How might it have been obvious had people been paying attention? What might people have seen in this city after that crash and moving through the years that could have indicated something was amiss?
Yeah, well, there had been Breadlines in New York for a long time, ever since the end of the 19th century. So this was already a kind of New York institution. Breadlines were located, most of them, on the Bowery, to serve this kind of itinerant population of seasonal workers who went out into the countryside during warm weather and did farm work and other kinds of manual labor, then came back to New York in the winters and sort of wintered over on the Bowery. The Breadlines were an important form of sustenance for this population, and they were something very much attached to hobo culture. What you see during the Depression, and this is very strange for the people who witnessed it, is that the Breadlines sort of detach from hobo culture, and they start appearing in neighborhoods where Breadlines are not supposed to appear. And one of the earliest was on Fifth Avenue. So this was really striking. And you can imagine the shopkeepers put up a tremendous fuss because it was such a downer.
Not in my backyard.
Yeah,
right?
But that was just the first. And there were many more. The Breadlines multiplied very quickly during that first winter of 1930, 1931, until there were, at one point, 82 breadlines running in the city and feeding hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people.
So when we think about, say, people with jobs, average middle class suddenly hungry, we think about other places. We think about Venezuela today, maybe, where one day you had a job, with the government, and the next day you're waiting for food. How would people reconcile? I mean, why wouldn't that information cause an immediate reaction? It seems to have taken some time in your book. Maybe Andy, from the governance perspective, what would have kept that from having an impact?
Well, I mean, I guess the question is, why didn't the government sort of leap into the breach and do something sooner? Very simply because there was no history of it, there was no tradition of that. It was not thought to be government's role to feed hungry, unemployed people. If you were unemployed, it was essentially your fault. I mean, it was a kind of moral failing, and you were not deserving of food charity if you were an able-bodied person, particularly an able-bodied man. And it took a long time to get over those biases towards feeding the hungry. It was different in different parts of the country. But in New York, New York was actually probably the first city where the government said we have to do something because the Breadlines aren't enough, because the Breadlines are all various private charities. Something larger has to go on here. It was a lot of places, even by the end of the Depression, were still refusing to feed the hungry, or feeding them something which was essentially could keep them just from starving to death, but nothing more.
So I want you to comment on that too, but one of the things I'm going to point out to you, we'll do a little meta commentary, is because we're going to come back to this. The resonances today that I sort of see as a legacy of this time, because some of what Andy just said, you pick up the paper this morning and you'll see echoes of that, and they preceded this moment, obviously. We didn't just decide America wasn't a place where we gave out free food, and it didn't necessarily change until things got dire. You were going to add to that?
I guess I was going to add that two things. One, it was hard to believe that people in New York, middle-class people, not people who had a history of poverty, were hungry. So wrapping one's head around this concept proved very difficult. And I also wanted to point out something about the Breadlines, which is obvious, but not obvious, which is that this was all improvised. Each breadline had a different sponsor in a different building, in a different neighborhood. Each breadline found funds differently. Some collected food from restaurants, some collected donations, some had very wealthy sponsors. So it was all this sort of kind of flailing around without any model to follow.
To add a little bit more food into that conversation, you don't immediately go from not having money to not having food necessarily. And so there were other things happening agriculturally at the moment, were there not? Wasn't it? Okay, that's a question for Andy.
Well, what was happening in agriculture had direct repercussions on what ended up on the table or didn't end up on the table. And actually, agriculture had been in more or less a depression ever since the early 1920s because the farms had geared up for huge overproduction during World War I with government support. And then the market for all their food products disappeared. But they kept producing way more food than we could consume, and they didn't have European markets anymore. And so they had been in depression for this time. And then what happened with the beginning of the depression in 1929 is that agricultural prices fell so rapidly that it no longer paid to bring goods to market. So if you had pigs or corn or wheat or tomatoes or whatever, transportation costs were so expensive, and that they would completely eat into your profit. And so farmers started destroying their produce rather than bringing it to market. And there's a well-known book by a woman, a food historian called Breadlines Knee Deep in Wheat. And so that was the sort of cruel irony of the Depression. And so people were starving amid this plenty, and it was a big shock to Americans.
So what was some of the reaction, besides the sort of helter-skelter breadline or immediate service of people hungry in the moment? What eventually motivated something to change, governance-wise, locally, regionally, nationally? And when did that kick in?
Well, do you want to talk about terror?
Sure, talk about terror, yeah.
Yeah, well, what happened is that governments, in New York City at least, the government under Mayor Jimmy Walker saw that it wasn't very good for the image of New York City to have all these breadlines out there. And at the same time, New York was one of the centers for social work, with all the settlement houses down here on the Lower East Side, and also lots of schools where social workers were in training. And the social workers hated breadlines because this was not like an organized, rational, and humane way to feed the hungry. At least that's what they thought. And they wanted some sort of like citywide program to feed the hungry. And so between the Jimmy Walker and the social workers, they first started the New York City Police Department actually first started handing out food boxes. And that didn't work very well. Okay.
I just want to say a word about that because it's another one of these crazy, what do you call that word, of something that's cobbled together? A crazy cobbled together thing.
So 3 words, but we'll take it. Yeah.
Because the way he did it, he got each of his department heads, and there are 37 departments in the city of New York. So there's transportation and there's sanitation and et cetera, et cetera. He gave them each tasks. He asked each city employee to contribute 1% of their income. And then he used each of these departments in some way to collect and disseminate food. And it all started with a huge canvas of the poor. So he got the police department to go around door to door asking who was hungry. And then the police department later the police stations became these food relief depots. So people who had no background in food relief were suddenly drawn into this sort of highly improvised food relief system.
But the hunger crisis was happening not just in New York City, but also across New York State. Just to take an example from this region, and the governor, of course, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, under the after some prodding by some social workers, both he and his wife were very, very closely allied with the sort of progressive social work movement at the time. He started something called the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration, and this was the first time that any state government in the United States had agreed to feed the hungry and help the unemployed as a statewide program. And this was extremely radical for the time. And so they began to set up offices. People would have to go to apply for relief. And then if they passed the various questionnaires and everything like that, then they would be given boxes of food and rent. They would pay the rent. They would give them money for fuel and all that kind of stuff. So it was a really big thing, and it really sort of pointed the direction of what would happen later in the New Deal.
Right. Well, and he would go from governor of New York State to president of the country in some ways because of his recognition of what was actually happening and his lack of resistance to...
Well, I mean, because he was running against Herbert Hoover, and Herbert Hoover refused categorically. He thought it was un-American and weakening of morale and weakening of the spirit of American individualism to give food to the hungry and to give food to the unemployed.
Yes. Please, yeah.
Yeah, there's a tremendous irony in Hoover's position. because during World War I, he led an effort to feed millions of starving Europeans in the wake of World War I.
But that was them. That was them.
Yeah, that's okay for them.
Right.
But it's nothing that we should bring home to America. Right. That kind of system is not right for us.
Ironic also, I would say, that Roosevelt, who represented the city where it's dog eat dog, sink or swim, survival of the fittest, is the one with the caring handout. You know, as New Yorkers, we're always trying to remind people we're actually very nice people. We're actually chatty, and we'll talk to you online, and we might give you food if you're starving, perhaps. So Roosevelt goes from governor of New York, representing New York, to the top job, and what does he bring there? Like, what do you think, besides the recognition that we can actually help people and still be American and still claim something unique to us? What's that change? And how, particularly about food, about the role that food plays?
Well, I think one of the things that Roosevelt brought to the campaign and then to the presidency, what really attracted people about him was his dynamism. I mean, this guy was a guy who exuded optimism and a kind of like spirit of we can win this thing, and people just really felt that they could follow him as opposed to the dour President Hoover. And Roosevelt was also an experimenter. I mean, if things weren't working, he was always willing to try something new. And the first 100 days of the New Deal and the other programs that happened in 1933 really were people had voted for him for change, and they got change. And as far as food was concerned, essentially what they did was they expanded TERRA onto a national scale. TERRA became FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. And both TERRA and FERA were under the control of Harry Hopkins, who was a New York City social worker who was an incredible organizational genius, and figured out how to build this thing on a national scale. And from mid-1933 through the end of 1935, they fed millions of Americans, and it made a huge difference in people's lives.
I'd like to pivot a little bit, because we don't have a ton of time left, to sort of food and gastronomy, away from government and governance, and talk a little bit about the shift in the approach of food, the sort of rise of nutritionism, if you will, that helped address or help people try to deal with the hardship that they were facing.
Yeah, a little background on nutrition. It was still a new science during the Depression. It really sort of came at the turn of the century is really when you see the first important nutritional studies in the United States. And it's very important that these nutritional studies were directed almost exclusively at poor people. And the idea of these studies is that we would learn what people really needed, the essential nutrients that they must consume daily, so they didn't have to buy so much food, and they would have more income, and that would ease working class discontent.
Strategic eating.
Yes, right. So there's always been a lot of politics in nutrition, and that continued, and it continues today. At the turn of the century, we knew about the chemical composition of food, like carbohydrates and proteins and fats. During the teens and 20s, we learned about vitamins and minerals, and this was a big breakthrough. During the Depression, a group of women who called themselves home economists, and these are not the home economists that you might remember if you were in classes in the 60s or 70s. These were sort of warriors, very highly motivated, highly intelligent, political crusaders who believed that they could save America from malnutrition through nutritional education.
And that nutritional education and that emphasis on the nutrition of food shifted really what American food was at that time, did it not? I mean, through mass media, you guys explore various ways that people were trying to communicate a way to sustain oneself better, perhaps not more deliciously, maybe deliciously enough, and get through a moment that I think resonates to this day.
Well, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking, Mitchell, but I'll answer what I think you're asking.
That's my secret technique, is to just, yeah.
Is that the Depression did not invent a new food sensibility. These home economists had been sort of cooking in this, I don't know how to describe what it was a very utilitarian, straightforward, WASP,
Science-y.
American science-y cooking.
Right.
And they already had this, ready to go when the Depression
They came into service, right? They found an opportunity.
That's exactly right. It was a cuisine looking for an emergency, and they got their emergency.
It's so romantic when you put it that way. Yes.
And people were desperate
Right.
for this kind of information because, people, they didn't have jobs, they didn't have enough food, and they were particularly concerned about their families, about growing children, whether their children would have enough food to thrive and to become strong, American adults. And so it was really, really important. And they were always writing in to government home economics experts and to magazines, questioning, what is a vitamin? How do I, what kind of vitamins do I need? And through all these ways, when governments handed out food boxes, they would also hand out lists of recipes for healthy combinations of food and menus. And every food magazine, from Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, would have tons of articles on vitamins and what foods are filled with vitamins. So it was a big issue of the day.
And you say people wanted to know, but we really mean women wanted to know for their families. So was there a shift? Was there a shift in the power dynamic here, gender related, or not really? Not so much. I love asking historians questions about supposition and what ifs because they hate them.
Well, one of the weird things about relief in general and sex roles and family during the Great Depression was that the government really thought it was extremely important for not to disrupt the traditional American family. So only one person in the family could accept the relief, and that would be the man. Or if there would be given government jobs, and there was a family, the wife could never get the government job, only the man could. And what the home economics people were trying to do was empower women, but not break up that kind of dynamic. So it was a complicated balancing act that was going on.
But probably a relief in some to share the burden, and theoretically, we can imagine, to have just the man, or to actually share the responsibility of trying to figure it out. I don't know.
Well, what women had was the knowledge.
Right. How to feed.
Yeah,
right.
how to feed. And, knowledge is power.
Yeah.
So they did
You're scaring me now.
Yeah. So they did have a kind of new power, but it was sort of a secret power.
Right. So a couple of minutes left, and to me, I work for an organization, the Jane Spirit Foundation, that is constantly looking at the landscape of American food and our food system and trying to find ways to improve an appreciation of it, to improve quality, and to improve access. And what struck me as I read the book, and I will make a plug again, you need to read this book. And even if you don't read this book, you need to buy this book, because by buying these sorts of books, you support this kind of work, which is really important. I mean that seriously. It's not enough to read the review. You need to purchase it even if you don't read the book. You need to own it. And that is that so much of what we're working to change, and so what some people are working to change today, seems to be a legacy of this time, a shift in a food system that needs to overproduce because there's a threat of hunger. There are all these sorts of things that we are now dealing with the consequences of and trying to find a way against. I wonder if you could speak a little bit both to the policy legacy and also the gastronomic legacy of this period, to the extent that you can see it today resonating around us. Please do. It's your license to make it up.
Okay. Well, I think the gastronomic legacy of the Great Depression is what the Great Depression did was kind of erase a lot of the last vestiges of 19th century habits of eating in the United States. I mean, that's definitely an exaggeration to some extent, but it's also true. Mm-hmm. And what the government was trying to do and what the home economics people were trying to do was to build a modern food system. And with modern ways of eating, with modern ways about thinking about food as based on science, not based on pleasure or tradition. And in a lot of ways also the government was trying to build up just the infrastructure for a modern food system, like farm roads, so the farmers could bring their produce to regional markets rather than just selling it in the local town. And also things like refrigeration were coming into, and appliances were becoming widespread at that time, and rural electrification, which helped farmers, for instance, power those appliances. And so the world that we live in today of frozen foods, supermarket, out-of-season produce, all those kinds of things, is a legacy of that time. And that's when really the foundations were really built. It didn't come to fruition, I think, until the 1950s, but this was certainly the beginning. So that's one of the things.
Well, and I think it's a really important thing to understand, because sometimes, certainly with people I find myself sitting around a table with, we think it was this massive, manipulative, almost evil production, and when in fact it was solving some very real issues in some very sophisticated modern ways that are different now. We have to find a way to reconcile that. Do you want to comment about the gastronomic legacy a little bit, or?
Well, it's it's sort of the anti-legacy, right. Which is that the Depression. Well, let me put it this way: home economists saw the Depression as an opportunity to espouse their scientific eating program. But there was another contingent during the Depression, and these were men and women who were interested in more sort of sensory, sensuous, historical and traditional American eating, it could be just as economical if you paid attention. They saw the Depression as a moment to return to a way of eating that was threatened by this growing food modernity. So we see figures like Sheila Hibben, who wrote a cookbook in 1932 called the National Cookbook, which is her attempt to pick out, preserve, and document and preserve these great regional dishes from around the United States. The pan dowdies and the chowders and the Cajun gumbos and so the Depression also left us with that.
Fascinating. And we find ourselves today at that same sort of moment where the answer to modernity, some people think, is to go backwards. Some people think it's to move forwards with some values, perhaps from the past and the technologies we have today. I think that I'll stop there and keep you hungry for the book. I will say again, buy it. It's not mine, so I get to sell it very unshamefully. Please purchase this book. I think it's hard to understand the value of this sort of history, which for a long time wasn't even considered real history, but actually adds to our real understanding of who we are and what it means to be Americans interested in food today. And so we need to support more stuff like this. I will thank you for the conversation and open the floor to questions, if I may. We have a microphone circulating somewhere, I believe, and there are some questions.
I don't need, okay.
You do need the microphone because this is live on the internet.
Okay. So some of us in the room have
experience with speaking with people from Europe who have endured wartime shortages in concentration camps, making do with next to nothing. For example, in Memory's Kitchen, there's a sketch of somebody, the sketch is called Stooping for Potato Peelings, that potato peelings used to not be considered food for humans, it was considered food for animals, and making birthday cakes or birthday something sweets out of mixing used coffee grounds with a little bit of sugar, whatever. And somebody that I spoke with talked about making flour from the bark of trees. So that's a European, some European stories. Can you give us some examples of real depression, like making something from nothing to feed a family?
Well, I mean, just one of the things that, Annie, about your question is, I just want to comment, is that in American culture, up until the Great Depression, hunger was considered un-American. That wasn't something that happened to us. And so the culture kind of, I mean, but obviously people were hungry before the Great Depression. And I think that the culture, American culture, kind of hid or was not interested in hearing stories about hunger and food and making something out of nothing, like in Europe. But certainly, I mean, the kind of food that the hobos ate, like a mulligan stew, you know, which was made, you know, in the open air using an old tin can and with whatever ingredients that you could beg, borrow, or steal from you know, the farmers of the local population, is an example of that. I mean, I think the difference is that in, let's say, Italy, which has, you know, a great cuisine of poverty, a lot of the foods that we love today in Italian food are actually foods of poverty. That culinary sensibility did not exist in the United States. So people were making something out of nothing, but I don't think it was very good.
Not only...
Stretching, like here, sorry, I'm so sorry for taking up time, but just in the Tenement Museum, like in this place and in this neighborhood, there was the story about rubbing the herring on the bread so that the whole family could get the semblance of herring while the bread.
But those were immigrants.
Those were not. Those were old stories.
I mean,
in some of the areas afflicted by the miners' strikes, there were stories of families where the mother would take flour, wheat flour, and mix it with water, and that was the children's dinner.
Right. Well, that actually, well, flour and water pancakes were for the Okies and the, you know, the itinerant farm laborers in California was you know, one of the staples.
Right. But again, you know, this America to a large extent was the answer to the hunger problems from the beginning of the old world, right? The new world was the land of plenty, both figuratively and literally. And so interesting juxtaposition. Other questions? I saw some hands way in the back against the window.
So I'm just kind of curious about immigrant communities and in urban areas during that time. The new food science and these food scientists who were promoting kind of a new American way of eating, was it kind of a top-down influence in terms of how these different ethnic groups adjusted their traditional cooking, or was it kind of a bottom-up where it was kind of known in the community that, oh, if you want to make this particular dish, maybe substitute this instead of that? Or how was ethnic traditional cooking affected by these actions and these efforts?
Well, I know a little bit about this from working on the book about 97 Orchard and about the Baldizzi family, who did receive food relief under terror, under Governor Roosevelt. And many of the foods they received were foods that they wouldn't necessarily choose of their own. They got, for example, large wooden cases of American cheese. So you can imagine, right. I think the idea is they found a way to make American cheese acceptable. That wasn't, and later they used the boxes that the cheese came in as planters. That was part of the family mythology.
Right.
Yeah. But it was a problem for immigrants who received these food handouts from governments filled with ingredients that they had no experience with and no taste for. So that was a problem. On the other hand, some effort was made in New York City to bring foods to immigrant households that was culturally acceptable. And we know, for example, that the Jews got matzah.
Right.
So it was very thoughtful.
Right.
But also the Jews got salt pork, and then they would. But then they knew, they had Italian neighbors, so they would, swap.
Right.
So they made do.
And then there's the grandmother serving grandfather the schnitzel out of pork, but not telling him that it wasn't veal, which we all have in our family, I think. Other question, great question. This is the fun part about doing one of these talks in New York City is the audience knows as much as anybody.
So you spoke about them handing out recipes with the food boxes, and I just wondered how illiteracy rates affected that and communicating it. Presumably they weren't in a position to read the recipes. So how was that affecting the distribution?
We didn't really look at that. But I think that's a great question. And also the question, even if they handed out the recipes, did people actually follow them? I mean, that's like the great mystery about cookbooks: is does anybody ever make the recipes in the cookbook? And so we don't really know. But some people took it very seriously because this did come with the stamp of approval of the government. And it did, and as we said, that people were very desperate for food advice and nutrition advice. So some people definitely read these seriously. But out in rural areas where there was where literacy was probably a little bit rarer, I'm not so sure. I mean, they would have prepared these foods just like they had prepared them in the past, and it wouldn't have changed.
You mentioned the shift from the 19th century table to the 20th century table. What were the primary markers of that shift in terms of what was on the table and what people were eating? How did it manifest?
Well, in the 19th century, food was much more regional than it is today, so it depends on where you were. And let's say, I mean, one of the things we talk a bunch about in our book is the traditional food of poor people in the Cotton Belt in the South, from Virginia all the way to Texas. And I mean, that food is what's called the 3M diet. Meat, which is salt pork, meal, which is cornmeal, and molasses. And perhaps with some biscuits, flour biscuits, put in there as well. And that is a diet which developed during slavery. It's based on the foods that the slave owners gave to their slaves, and it became traditional for cotton farm workers, sharecroppers, and tenant farmers to eat that for a lot of the year. And they also had pork. They also had a pig which they slaughtered once a year, and sweet potatoes. But that was like the main diet. And in other parts of the country, you had what was called meat, potatoes, pie, and pancake diet.
That one sounds good.
Yeah. And which was, during the summer you had a garden and you got greens and you had canned food and stuff like that. But one of the sort of downsides to the traditional diet in rural America, wherever, was spring fever. At the end of February and March, you hadn't had greens in a long, long time, and you started getting malnutrition defects like scurvy. And people started feeling a little like lightheaded because they weren't getting their vitamin C. And when the first sprouts of greens came up in the fields, like onions and things like that, everybody went out and gathered them and cooked them. And this was the cure for spring fever.
There was also, are you familiar with Andrew Haley's work, Turning the Tables? He does a history of restaurants from the 1880s to the 1920s and talks about a shift from the aristocratic French cuisine, a class shift to an appreciation of the ethnic diversity of food that then begins to resonate in American food. So it was a way to address the sort of limitations of French menus and French restaurants and French dining, but for the middle class to assert themselves by going to eat like we go to eat in Queens and Flushing or whatever, and these sorts of things, which is another shift that happened to sort of validate, almost separate an identity tied to an elevated form of eating and equalize the field a little bit by necessity. When you're hungry, you eat things. Yeah.
Hi. You spoke briefly about, the health implications of this time period, and I wonder if you might speak a little bit to how food practices of this time period influenced mental health and body image, given food scarcity.
That's a hard one.
Well, I mean, it's hard to... People didn't really think about that at the time. Well, it's not written about, I think. Maybe they thought about it, but it's not... I mean, we didn't see very much in that in the material that we went over. I mean, they were concerned about nutrition and children, growing healthy children. And also, I mean, they were, people were starving to death.
And was there evidence of shame at thinness because it meant you were starving to death?
Well, there was certainly shame at receiving relief.
Right.
I mean, there was a huge... People had a lot of issues, particularly in rural America. If somebody received relief, and it would be the man because he's the head of the household, it showed that he had failed.
Right.
And some people refused to accept relief, and their families suffered. But they were, had shown that they were still in control of their little world of their household, but their children were not doing well.
Mm.
I've heard you talk about Depression-era foods that you think are really awful, the baked onions with peanut butter. But I'm curious whether you found any that you think are really pretty good and that have been lost and that you'd like to bring back.
Well, tonight, maybe you'll have found them in our buffet. We have a really nicely prepared lima bean loaf, which I think is a kind of a falafel relative, and a pretty handsome liver ball. I think you get the idea, Sandy. That's not what this period was about. And no, I didn't come across... it was just the opposite. I came across dishes that were so bizarre. And this was one of the sort of characteristics of home economics cooking, is that it brought together elements that had no reason to be on the plate together other than they added they added up to the right nutritional, they gave you the right nutrients. So I came across, this was a really weird dish, a recipe for whole wheat berries cooked with tomatoes and canned salmon. Why would you bring these elements together? Well, because they give you carbohydrate, protein, the tomatoes give you vitamin C, so you're getting sort of a nice nutritional, you're getting hit, yeah. Right. But while you're eating it, maybe you're not so happy.
Speaks almost to your question of where are those foods? They're not, they're in that muck that you just made for dinner.
Yeah.
Yes. The microphone, please, so they can hear it at home.
Two very different questions. The first one, did the schools provide food for the children?
Oh, yeah.
And the second one is, when I think of when my grandparents would talk about food, I can't imagine that they ever heard of anything from these home economic ladies. I don't think they knew about vitamins. They only knew about, from what I gather, potatoes, rice, and bread, anything that would fill you up. So I was wondering, did the home economic ladies, their expertise filter down to the man on the street or the lady on the street?
Two very good questions.
Yeah. Do you want to do which? Well, the school lunch question is very interesting, and it's I think one of the really important legacies of the Depression is that we believe we should feed our kids lunch in school, and it became sort of national policy during the Depression. In the book, we tell the story of how it kind of came about in New York, and that's its own story because New York is its own city, and nothing happens here the way it happens other places. But it was in this city, home economists became very involved in forming a lunch program for students, and what they did was they enlisted their home economics classes to start preparing lunch for students. So class time became the time when you were the school cook. So you would cook that morning for that afternoon, and then that afternoon you would make dessert for tomorrow's lunch. So it was really the students were feeding themselves. The lunch program also became very important as a way to Americanize immigrant eaters. And I'm just wondering, when you ask the second question, were your grandparents immigrants? So they might have been, because of language, harder to reach than other maybe English-speaking Americans. But yes, it did filter down, but not evenly. And I could very well imagine that an immigrant couple would have been the kind of people who weren't in the information flow, yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I work with low-income families in New York with the food stamp program. During the Depression, we were learning how to provide food for all those people that were hungry. What would you say we learned for today's poverty and hunger, and where do we have more to learn? Because I see great deficiencies in providing food for the hungry in New York City.
Well, that's a great question. And actually, the food stamp program began toward the end of the Great Depression, I think in 1939 or 1940. It lasted just a couple of years, then it ended during World War II. And I think it wasn't restarted until LBJ's War on Poverty in 1964. And I think, the legacy of the Depression is, and certainly of Roosevelt's New Deal, is that we have recognized that we owe a responsibility to unemployed, hungry people who are unable to put enough food on their tables. But also the legacy of the Depression is that we're still having a lot of the same arguments about whether this is right or how best to go about it. It's the same kind of arguments which went on during 1932 and 1933 are going on today. And I find that kind of depressing that we haven't really just moved on from that.
A different form of depression.
Yeah. And all about things about individual responsibility and dependency and whether this is moral or American or not. And so we've recognized that we should feed the hungry, but we're still sort of mired in some of those same debates.
Anyone else? I'm curious.
I have a comment about something. My parents grew up during the Great Depression, and I told you earlier, my mother used to say we used to eat ketchup sandwiches. I know what came out of the Depression is a lot of people that struggled would say You have to clean your plate. You don't leave anything on your plate. And I know when I was growing up, the thing was, there's kids starving in Africa or Biafra, and everyone then would say, well, can we just mail our leftovers to them or something? And in answer to the question about body image, I mean, I remember when they say we entered World War II, they described the young GIs as they were also skinny and scrawny because they weren't overweight then because they were all just struggling to survive food-wise.
And even today, the link between bodily health and national security is being made constantly in policy decisions. Now it happens to be obesity is the stress, ironically, but not unconnectedly. But yeah, one of the big motivators, I think, is the fitness to defend of a people.
Right, and actually, I mean, it's something which people don't really realize, but we discovered when reading the book was that Roosevelt fed Americans up until January 1, 1936, and then he stopped all federal food relief, or most federal food relief. And then it came back a little bit towards the end of the 1930s and early 1940s, and that was because of the threat of war. But Roosevelt was, you know, he had some of the same problems with giving food relief that Herbert Hoover had. He decided that food relief sapped American individualism and the will to work. And so, you know, it was war which really turned everything around, and then suddenly anything could be done for the hungry and to make people, give people enough food, and then everything changed.
Amazing. A final, yeah, sure. One more.
Did the Depression cuisine change our tastes, or has it had a long-lasting effect on the foods that we like or are interested in today?
I know I love a good wheatberry salmon, tuna surprise, tomato surprise.
I mean, I can see the legacy of Depression cooking in a lot of institutional food. That's where I think it went after the Depression. All of those creamed lima beans had to go somewhere, and they went to places like hospitals and school lunchrooms.
Interesting.
And also, there may be a kind of I think there was a reaction against Depression foods once the economy turned around, and I think people really wanted to move on from them and hopefully forget them, because people became, you know, once World War II, a lot of soldiers went to other countries and saw how people in Italy or Germany or wherever eat, and I think people became a lot more adventurous and just didn't want anything to do with these foods. And one of the things about these foods was that flavor was always second. Nutritional content and price were much more important than flavor. So there was no reason for people to fall in love with them, I think.
And on that not delicious note, I think that we should thank, a big round of applause, I think, both for this conversation and for the work. Thank you.